Hello and welcome to this video called A Model to Understand Networking. And in this video I'm going to introduce a model called the Osi model. This was created quite a while ago. I think it was in the mid-80s. So it's pretty old, but it's very useful when you're learning about networking. I often reference back to it in my head when I'm learning about some new topic. But it's especially useful at the beginning of the journey of learning about networking. So yeah, it's very useful. If you've seen my first video, I'd recommend you watch that first because I explain what networking is. And now this video would complement that video well. It's going to go into a little bit more depth. It's not a very detailed video, so it's still meant for beginners. Okay, so let's get into it. So this model is the Osi model, as I said, and OSI is just an acronym for Open Systems Interconnection. So it was it is an open model that a standards company pretty much just brought out, so that vendors and people designing it, and just it's useful for people to know about this stuff. They can reference this model and know a bit more about how networking works. So it's a 7-layer model. So I'll draw the layers here. So at the very bottom, we've got the physical layer. And as we go up, it'll get sort of more logical, but this is the easiest layer to comprehend. So I'll come back to it in a minute. So then we've got the data link layer. And if you've heard of MAC addresses, then that's where they sit. And then we've got the network layer. And this is where IP addresses do their thing. And then we've got transport. If you've heard of TCP or UDP, that's where they sit. And then we've got session. Okay, this is to do with starting and stopping and managing different sessions we've got with other computers on the internet. Presentation. This is to do with encryption and certain formatting and as it says, just the presentation of the data. And then application. So this is the layer where the application sort of will, as we'll see, it'll send data and it'll come down this layer. So these are the layers: physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, application. So 7 layers. And before I go into explaining each layer in a bit more depth, I'm actually going to draw an alternate model that I prefer to use, because these top 3 layers, in a more updated model, they sort of just shoved them into one, and it'll just make it a little more simple. So I like to think of it as physical, data link, network, transport, and then just application. So we've sort of just shoved these 3 into one, so it's sort of a 5-layer model. And so let's go into a bit more detail about each layer. So the physical layer is the layer that deals with actually getting the electricity or the electromagnetic radiation throughout the world, and the certain they call it line coding mechanisms, and fancy words that are pretty much to do with the electrical part of it. Okay, so this layer is pretty easy to get your head around. Like here I've got a cable, a bit of network cable. Okay, and this will actually, data will, by alternating a current, data goes across this cable. But this is sort of the stuff you see at the physical layer. It's the real stuff you can feel, all the, the radio waves. So that's the physical layer. Now the data link layer, essentially here, where if we're using Ethernet or Wi-Fi, we're using MAC addresses to send data between the networking chips that sit on the computers. So the data link layer, which is the second layer, deals with, this is a very basic understanding, but just to keep it simple, it deals with MAC addresses. So at this layer, we're essentially adding a source and a destination MAC address, and that'll get the data from one computer to another. Okay, and then at the network layer, here we use IP addresses. So this is where the Internet Protocol's logic comes in. And this is quite similar to the MAC layer. We're adding a source and a destination IP address, and this will also be used by the devices and the intermediary networking devices to figure out where the data needs to go. So I was a little confused when I first learned as to why MAC addresses and IP addresses are used, because it's like kind of redundant. There's two sources and two destinations. But the best way to think of this is that they're actually different protocols that can work. Like, you don't have to use Ethernet, which uses MAC addresses, when you're using IP. You could have some other protocol sitting below it. So the reason is they were sort of developed independently. Actually, the use of IP addresses kind of came before Ethernet was used. So yeah, it is a bit confusing why there's both, but just for now, just you need to know that there is both, because for reasons beyond this, both two sources and two destinations are used. Okay. Now at this layer, we deal with port numbers. And these are kind of like, again, another source and a destination. But this isn't saying what specific machine you're going to. This is saying what application on the machine you're going to. So if it's some source port and then some destination port, the computer can know that it's, or the one coming in, like when it comes into the receiving computer, it'll know based on the destination port number which application it needs to send it to. So it's sort of like if the computer was a city and there were ports for ships to come in, maybe, this probably isn't realistic, but there were like 10 ports and each of them dealt with certain things. One port imported cars and another imported food and then another imported whatever. So it's sort of like you need to number those ports so that you know when the ship comes in, you need to direct it to the specific port that it needs to go in, that it needs to go to. So again, like all three of these layers are pretty much just using source and destination somethings plus other data or metadata that is within the bit they slap on, because I'll show you what I mean when they say they slap on. There's other data in that bit they slap on, but the most important thing to at the start to think about are the source and destination numbers, so the source and destination MAC or IP or port. And then the application layer, this is really just the like where the actual data is coming from, like a web page, all the stuff going on in the application's logic. So it's harder to understand up here because this is more logical. As you go up, it sort of gets more logical. This is physical, electrical stuff you can touch, and it sort of gets a bit more vague as you go up. But now I'll illustrate sort of what happens with two computers sending and receiving something. So they've got some cable between them, or maybe we're using radio waves. And pretty much there's these 7 layers, right? Actually, I'm going to draw these computers down the bottom here. So there's the 7 layers, like we said, or the 5 if you're dealing with this altered model I like to use. And here up at the application layer, essentially here's the data. Okay. And as we move down, now when you send data, you're sending it down this model. As you receive data, you're sending it back up to the top. Because at the end of the day, the applications up the top, they're the things that want to talk to each other. So this process is called encapsulation, and this process is called de-encapsulation, or just decapsulation. So really, it's like getting the data think of it as a piece of paper you want to send with a message on it. What you'd do if you were going to send that to someone through like the postal system is you'd encapsulate it in like an envelope. Okay, you'd probably only put it in one envelope, but in this case, you're essentially encapsulating the data in quite a few envelopes. So pretty much what I'm drawing here is bits of what they call a header that is added, and pretty much the header is saying, here's the source and destination, and then within it, so like this header will say, within me is this, so within it is the data. Then this header would say, within me is this, which is both layers above, and then this header pretty much says, within me is this, which is all the layers above. So as it goes down, each layer is encapsulated by the other one. So it's like getting a letter, putting it in one envelope, writing some certain data that's important, getting another envelope, putting all that in it, writing some more data on the envelope that's important, and then again putting that in another envelope and writing more data. Okay, so that's this encapsulation process. So encapsulation. Okay, and now once we get to the physical layer, right, the bottom layer, yeah, I'm keeping this fairly basic, but once we're getting down to the physical layer, that's taking it across the cable or the air with, you know, the radio waves, and then the other end we're just doing the opposite. So we're getting that big parcel with a bunch of envelopes. We're ripping off the first envelope and looking what we wrote on the when we encapsulated it on the outside, and seeing what, you know, that certain things, source and destination. Okay, this is for me. And then we're taking that envelope out, getting what's inside that, looking at the data that's, or the writing that's on the outside of that envelope, and then again taking that out and looking at the other header, and then taking that out, and finally we get the application stuff, and that's what we want to see, is the application, what we're going to interpret. Or, you know, if an analogy of two people sending a letter to each other, this is like the letter here. Once we've added all the envelopes, shipped it, and removed all the envelopes, we're then going to just read the letter and do whatever we need to do from there. So this is encapsulation and decapsulation. So this is really what the OSI model helps you to explain. I could go into much more detail about each layer, but pretty much each layer is just a bunch of agreed upon bits of, you know, metadata, which is pretty much just stuff that tells you about the data, metadata, and that's just added at each layer. Okay, so that's the basic idea of this OSI model. What I'm going to do now is show you a piece of software called Wireshark, and this looks super intimidating at first, but pretty much, I'm just going to move this over so you can see. I don't want you to cut the screen off for you. So this application called Wireshark can just capture packets, and it can, you know, show you them in a representation that humans can understand. So each line here is a packet, right? And at the moment, you can see my computer is sending data to, you know, certain places out on the internet. Well, that's not, but, you know, here, that's some place out on the internet. And then it's also, you know, sending data to other computers within my network. But this software allows us to look at the packet. And when we highlight a packet, what we get is the actual, you know, this is the actual hexadecimal representation of the packet, right? And then here, forget that, that's not very nice to look at. You can look at that. But here, we've got a sort of human readable version of what I was showing you before. So it's actually the other way around this time. But here's the application. Okay, this is some protocol. I'm not even too sure. There's so many protocols. Simple Service Discovery Protocol. I haven't dealt with this protocol. Okay, there's too many. There's thousands. So there's this. This is the application, right? And then encapsulated, right? Encapsulating that is the transport layer. So here we see the main important thing is the source port and the destination port. This is pretty much saying which applications we're going to. Then encapsulated by that is the network layer, and there's a bunch of other stuff, but pretty much we're looking at the source and destination IP addresses here. And then what encapsulates that is the data link layer. And here we've pretty much, the important bits are the destination and the source. So this is like, you know, if you receive this is like the outer envelope. Inside it is this, inside that is this, and then inside that is this. So it's like a bunch of envelopes surrounding each other. And so there you go. I hope you learned something new in this video, and you sort of understand this idea of encapsulation and decapsulation, and the fact that at each layer we're pretty much just adding data that will be used to get the data to source and destination and tell the computer what to do with it. That's the basic idea. So I hope the video was informative, and thank you for watching. Check out some more of my videos, and yeah, see you later.